And welcome into a Tuesday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Happy New Year's Eve to you. As we look at turning the calendar to 2025, there was obviously a lot that went on in the state of North Carolina throughout the year. Some of the major impacted stories here in the state that actually captured national attention. That's what we'll be going through this morning. The first, when President Joe Biden dropped his bid for re-election and Vice President Kamala Harris entered the race, there was a big question as to who would be her running mate. And there were a bunch of names thrown out there, including Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, and North Carolina's own Roy Cooper. Each of those candidates brought various political pros and cons to the table, and some thought that the selection of Cooper could help Harris claim victory in North Carolina and perhaps some other states like Georgia in helping her get 270 electoral votes to become the 47th president of the United States. But there was also a potential hiccup. A dated North Carolina law seemed to indicate that when the governor is absent from the state, something that Cooper would have needed to do consistently if he had secured the nomination, the lieutenant governor, which would be, as currently, Mark Robinson, would be in the position as the acting governor. That could have been something that was on Roy Cooper's mind. Ultimately, there was a bunch of factors that seemed to motivate Governor Roy Cooper from removing his own name from consideration, and he chose to remain in North Carolina and rally support for the Harris-Walz ticket that it would become, as well as guide the state through the aftermath of the catastrophe out in western North Carolina. And that brings us to our second major story that brought national and really international attention to North Carolina. And I say unfortunately because the spotlight that was shined on North Carolina was for nothing good, but for complete and total devastation out in western North Carolina. Hurricane Helene tore through the western half of the states and portions of other states in the southeast in late September of this year. In the aftermath of that, droves of support poured in from other states in the federal government, and that shined a very big spotlight on FEMA and Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as the administrator Diane Criswell. She was scheduled to remain on the ground until work was complete. President Joe Biden did an aerial tour of storm damage and visited Raleigh to meet with emergency officials. But in this situation, there was a lot of uncertainty and a lot of issues from both the state and federal level that became major news. And we'll be talking about some of those issues that are still ongoing in western North Carolina. We'll be joined by the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King, coming up a little bit later on this morning to discuss that. Survivors had lost their homes, their livelihoods, their businesses, their schools, all of that ripped away from them, and there was huge lapses of government on the ground. There was not enough federal help, and that caused some big-time issues. Diane Criswell clarified that the agency had enough funding to support recovery efforts from both Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton, which ravaged portions of western Florida, at least for the time being. However, FEMA would then need additional supplemental funding from Congress, and that was an ongoing topic as we led into the holidays with this government shutdown, a continuing resolution, and additional monies for states like North Carolina through FEMA. And of course, as it seems right now, the storm obviously is well subsided, but the devastation left in its path still very much on the minds of North Carolinians, as that relief and recovery work at both the state and federal level is going to take literally years before we've got any sort of relief in many of those areas, and that's going to be a big issue for new administrations, as the Donald Trump administration will be taking over in just a couple of weeks. At the federal level, Attorney General Josh Stein set to be sworn in just a matter of days, could potentially be as early as tomorrow, New Year's Day, and that's going to be something he's going to be dealing with. Of course, we've talked a lot about NCORE, the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency, the issues there as they are still dealing with cleanup from hurricanes that affected the state nearly a decade ago in the eastern portions of North Carolina. There are going to be a lot of questions, a lot of issues that the Stein administration is going to have to face. Republican lawmakers who will still be holding majorities in our state capitol, whether that be the House or the Senate, are going to continue to have to deal with additional funding. It's likely to be a big topic as we head into the budget season, which will be coming up a little bit later on this year, well, later on in 2025, I should say. So that's going to be a major topic both at the federal and state level that we'll keep an eye on here, right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And of course, arguably the biggest topic, the biggest political story of the year, President-elect Donald Trump wins the state of North Carolina for a third consecutive time in 2024. A state, very much a swing state that North Carolina is, was the first of all 7 swing states to be called on election night, and it was a huge landslide electoral victory for President-elect Donald Trump. However, it wasn't all great for Republicans as they dropped the gubernatorial race in one of the largest margins in over 40 years, with Democrat Attorney General Josh Stein handedly defeating Mark Robinson by over 800,000 votes. Republicans did turn the state auditor's office red, and Democrats flipped 2 other positions in the Council of State, both lieutenant governor and superintendent of public instruction. The Democrats lost 3 U.S. House seats due to redistricting. However, U.S. Representative Don Davis held on in the 1st district, that's in the northeastern half of the state, and was successful in beating Lori Buckout in the seen as the only toss-up district, NC1, here across the state of North Carolina. Notably, Democrats did prevent, at least by the numbers, a veto-proof supermajority in the North Carolina House. However, we have talked about in the last couple of weeks some potential issues that Democrats could be facing in the General Assembly that could make that point moot, as multiple lawmakers have come and spoken out against the Democrat Party. Those being Democrat members. We'll be tracking all of that in the weeks and months to come right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. And welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. And joining us this morning, the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King, to go over some of the news that we are tracking on the News Hour this morning. Donna, big news over the weekend. Jimmy Carter, the 39th President of the United States, passing away at 100 years of age. And he's got a legacy that ties deep here into North Carolina as well.
Sure, absolutely. Happy New Year, Nick. Yes, the 39th President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, passed away over the weekend on Sunday at the age of 100. Born in 1924, passing in 2024, just a few days shy of the new year. You're right. He's had a long legacy. Certainly, his presidency, his one-term presidency, was marred by just out-of-control inflation, economic problems, and the Iranian hostage crisis. So those things really marked his presidency, but his post-presidential life, his work with the Carter Center, humanitarian aid, his work in elections around the world, those things really defined who he was as a person, certainly winning the Nobel Peace Prize as well. So one of the links to North Carolina, of course, is in 2023, the Carter Center launched a group called the North Carolina Democracy Resilience Network. It was led by former Charlotte Mayor Jennifer Roberts and former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Bob Orr. Both of these, this is part of a nationwide effort the Carter Center put out to try and boost voter confidence in the elections system and in election integrity. They had a lot of events and town halls and that kind of thing as an effort to do that. I think what we saw in North Carolina, though, it had some bipartisan buy-in, even though, it was, of course, Democratic Mayor Jennifer Roberts really spearheading this project. But the Carter Center has done, gotten involved in election integrity efforts around the world. And I guess North Carolina bubbled up as one of the places that they felt like that was needed. So we did see them a lot in the Carter Center in North Carolina over the last 2 years, even as recently as Election Day here in 2024. But, Carter's work with Habitat for Humanity also had some projects here in North Carolina. He was a lifelong advocate for affordable housing and certainly community development, really feeling like that was part of what we needed to build up individuals, is to build the community around them.
Yeah, no question about that. And as you noted there at the top, obviously his presidency was one thing. Obviously, all of the issues that he dealt with there. It seems like he kind of reinvented himself, Donna, after he was out of the Oval Office and tried to rebuild his public image. He received a Nobel Peace Prize back in the early 2000s for some of that work. And I guess it's safe to say that the legacy through the Carter Center will continue on, not only here in North Carolina, but likely across the nation.
Sure, certainly. I think right now, so first, President Joe Biden has declared January 9th the National Day of Mourning. That will be Carter's funeral at the National Cathedral. But before that, he will lie in state in the state of Georgia because he was governor there as well, and at the Carter Center for 36 hours before he goes to Washington. So the details of the motorcade and some of that service, they're still being hashed out, and you can find the details of it as they become available on the Carter Center's website. They really are they are the ones that are keeping track of his legacy, continuing that work in his memory.
Well, so let's look at, you have an article up this morning over at carolinajournal.com. It's called 2024 in Review, a Year of Civic Engagement. That kind of ties into what we're talking about with Jimmy Carter this morning. What did you find in that article?
I really think we were looking back over 2024 to say, okay, what is the takeaway? I think one of the things that really struck me about 2024 is the level of civic engagement among North Carolinians at all voting ages and so, even younger. So I think it was really interesting to see, very high turnout among young voters, very engaged. And then certainly, high turnout in early voting in North Carolina among Republicans. So, Democrats were shorter on early voting than they normally are. But I do think that what we saw in 2024 was that the issues that are important to North Carolinians, just like other Americans, are the ones that really hit their kitchen table and their pocketbook. You could not escape the importance of, public safety and inflation when people went to the voting booths this year. So it really triggered this wave of civic engagement. And you could sense it really even in the days leading up to the election and immediately after that. I feel like we're seeing a lot of optimism for 2025 as those hours tick down here in the new year. Our latest poll for Carolina Journal, taken just after the election, found that a 21% jump in North Carolinians' optimism about the future following the election. So I'm really looking forward to that and hopefully seeing what happens in 2025. What will a new Trump administration, what will a new Stein administration do for North Carolina, and how will they capitalize on people's new civic engagement, increased civic engagement and optimism?
Don, I'm glad you bring that up, and obviously the issues, and we talked about those all leading up to the election, looking at various Carolina Journal polls and other polling across the nation. But whether people like it or not, Trump, of course, is only going to be serving one term in the Oval Office. And I think there's a lot of question as to what will that civic engagement look like when there's not somebody that's as bombastic and loved and hated equally as somebody like Donald Trump in the future of politics. Do we go back to a time where things aren't necessarily quite so exciting and it's just essentially business as usual?
I don't think you can put that toothpaste back in the tube, truthfully. I think that social media, Donald Trump, he's changed the game. He's changed what it means to have your own platform, obviously, your own messaging. The mainstream media is not the ones who control it from here on out. I think people are going to be able to access their elected officials directly. They're going to be able to give their opinions directly. That is a new world, and that is something that I don't think we're going to be able to undo. That said, we learned in this election that only Trump can be Trump. Those who tied themselves very, very closely to Trump did not do as well in North Carolina when it came down to the results of the 2024 election. So he has a unique voice in North Carolina and the American political system. So what comes after him? That's a good question. Does it mean that J.D. Vance will then try and take up that next term as a presidential candidate? I don't know. I mean, it does seem like Vance has created his own voice. He has a maybe more polished, sort of bombastic approach. He has his head around things like, Joe Rogan and all of these other voices that have become so powerful in the Republican Party, but also among Democrats. These are powerful voices and platforms that Vance seems to be able to tackle. But what it does mean is because only Trump can be Trump, he's got to really prove across the political spectrum that he can take that White House mantle in the next term.
Well, there's no question about that. And you brought up, building your own platform and talking about younger voters, the social media element of politics going forward, Donna. We'll likely see younger people engaged at earlier levels than probably ever before due to the fact that this information is available to them literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Absolutely. It's in their pockets. I mean, that has not happened to any other generation before now. And I think that has improved engagement, but it's also meant that there is a wide array of information out there, some right, some wrong. Over the weekend, I was traveling with my family to the Military Bowl game in Annapolis, and I was listening to my daughter talk about some of the social media things that she's seeing and the takes on what some of these influencers are saying are going to happen when Trump takes office. And, there may be a little grain of truth somewhere in there, but there is stuff in there that is just crazy. And they're not going to really have the historic knowledge to be able to parse it and know what's true and what's not. So TikToks, social media reels, those things are really shaping their view, sometimes really inaccurately. So I think as parents and as journalists, we have a responsibility to make sure that we clarify some of those and we stay engaged with social media so that we know what's going on out there.
And the Carolina Journal is, of course, on all major social media channels, is correct?
Absolutely. We are on YouTube and, Instagram, Facebook, and then, of course, carolinajournal.com.
We'll continue the conversation coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We continue our conversation this morning with Donna King, she the editor-in-chief over at carolinajournal.com. And Donna, unfortunately, as we get to turn the calendar into the new year, Western North Carolina Recovery and Relief still making news seemingly almost every single day. You spent some time out in Western North Carolina a couple months ago. Can you give us a quick recap on what that was like and then some new developments that you're tracking this morning?
Absolutely. So Hurricane Helene blowing through North Carolina, unbelievable damage to homes, cities, towns, properties, loss of life in North Carolina in late September. So October 12th-ish, I think. I went with Renee Olmos, who's our videographer for Carolina Journal, and we traveled with the North Carolina National Guard. We were able to be embedded with them, flew out of Salisbury to Western North Carolina, areas around Yancey County in the far west, areas that have been cut off, not seen power, help, medical assistance, name it. They just had no communication. The North Carolina National Guard delivered generators and supplies that they needed, and they allowed us to tag along. So we really had an opportunity to meet people who were hit, and really their lives have been changed by Hurricane Helene. And I've been fortunate enough to stay in touch with some of these families to see how their recovery has been going. And they are really frustrated right now. This 2025, they want to turn a new page like the rest of us, and they just have not been able to.
Yeah, so obviously the damage and destruction is going to take years for some of that to recover. We've seen some work out of the General Assembly allocating money, but Donna, the money is one thing. It's the time and the effort, especially for some of these very remote, hard-to-reach areas that we're talking about, of course, due to the mountainous terrain out in the western half of the state. And you're apparently chatting with some folks out there about some issues with some bridges that are going on. What's going on there?
I mean, I'd like to say it's a huge surprise, but I think anybody who's dealt with any kind of government situation, it's not. So these folks in this area called Little Creek in Burnsville, North Carolina, Yancey County, we had a great chance to meet these wonderful people who were hit by Hurricane Helene. When the storm came through, it washed out their access out of their community to the outside world. And they were the last to get power, last to get help. It felt like they were really, really isolated when we met them. So after a few weeks, an officer came to them and said, look, now Milton has hit. The help is going there right now. There are people buried alive in Pensacola. There's nobody coming. Just do what you need to do to help your neighbors in your community. So about 14, 15 of them got together, got their personal tractors, personal trucks, dump trailers, everything they had, and created an access road out of their community. Now, before that, they had been taking the older people to safety with four-wheelers and side-by-sides, whatever they had to help people. That's what they were doing. So this road gave them some more access. And then now, like a couple of weeks after that, that's how they were getting in and out. DOT contractors with the Department of Transportation, that this is what they're telling me. I've not gotten a response from DOT at this point, but I will still continue to try and update the story. But what the community members are telling me is that DOT came in and said, okay, this road isn't safe. This isn't going to work. They blocked it off with giant boulders and a ditch so they couldn't use it. And then the contractors built a low water bridge nearby so they could use that. Well, on Sunday, in all the rains, that DOT low water bridge has become compromised. So now they're stuck again. They're trapped again in their communities here, and they can't use the road they originally built because there's still boulders and a ditch in front of it. So they are super frustrated with this process and pictures, and it really is an issue, and it's happening in communities all over Western North Carolina.
Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying that they built a road because they, of course, needed to get in and out of their community, only to have contractors with the state government come in, block that road up, and presumably build something that was inferior to that because now it's washed out. Is that what you're saying, Donna?
I'm only hearing it from the community members right now, and I will certainly keep that story updated. DOT is efforting some information to try and fill in some of the gaps that I may have on this. So it's an ongoing story. It's really in process right now, so you won't find it on carolinajournal.com just yet, but certainly we are working this story now. But these community members are looking for help, and they said that they just are really, really struggling. One of the men that I spoke with said, look, I've gotten $750 from FEMA, and this has been a ton of work over the last few months. I'm not able to get to my job. He said that these 14 people who repaired the road to let them get in and out originally, they moved 40 tons of rock to give their community access to the outside world. And now they're saying, that they can't use it because of these boulders and this ditch that's been dug in front of it. So, I'm hoping that DOT has some, good explanation or some action that they can take, because this is an overwhelmingly large project that DOT is taking on. The repair is going to go, weeks and months, years perhaps, to get that infrastructure back up and running. But on a day-to-day basis, communities like Little Creek, they are trapped even again.
Well, and obviously it's easy to use government as a punching bag, Donna, and I don't think that's what necessarily we're talking about this morning. But even in your first visit up there, it was groups like Samaritan's Purse and others that were actually delivering these supplies. Now, yes, through the vehicle of, in this case, of the National Guard through the federal level, but these supplies and what was being delivered was from private charities, correct?
Everything that we delivered on that day when we were there with the National Guard was all delivered by Samaritan's Purse. So they drummed up probably 50 or 60 whole house generators, the fuel to go with it. And it was amazing to see the way private charity like Samaritan's Purse and the North Carolina National Guard, with direction from the North Carolina Department of Emergency Management, really coordinated that to get supplies in there. But that's a lot of moving parts. And there are people who are struggling hour to hour. When we got there was one woman who was within an hour of not having oxygen anymore. So that was the first thing they had to do when the guardsmen landed, is get a generator over to that woman who really was down to her last few breaths on an oxygen tank. So, these are critical things that these large organizations and government have to tackle and really think about the end user, those who are really struggling.
Well, and I think that's what folks are going to be looking at as we head into the new year. Obviously, we're going to be looking at a new governor in Josh Stein in the governor's mansion, new Republican leadership in the General Assembly, especially at the House level. And Don, I think it's fair for folks to demand answers from their elected officials as to how quickly some of this stuff is going to get back up and running.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it can't be soon enough for the people who are really struggling with it. Now, I will say this community in Yancey County said that they were over a month with no power when things were first looking pretty grim. That power infrastructure is really compromised after Helene. So, the long-term fixes of this, it's going to be a painful process, certainly. But they do have some temporary fixes in place, things like this low water bridge that they're trying to give people access while they build the more permanent structures. It's going to be an ugly process, and people are really frustrated.
Donna will continue to track that story. You can read the latest details when they are available by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Don't forget that you can stream our show live on YouTube each and every weekday morning by visiting our Carolina Journal YouTube channel. You can also take the show on demand on the go by checking out the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows, whether you have an iPhone or an Android device or tablet. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour, tap the subscribe or follow button, and take the show with you on demand on your own time. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. Continuing our Waste Watch series this morning over at carolinajournal.com. This is a series in which Carolina Journal shines a spotlight on wasteful government spending, both at the state and federal levels, and exposes projects that squander taxpayer dollars. Yesterday morning, we spent some time talking about some waste in regards to electric vehicles as well as rural internet infrastructure, in which tens of millions of dollars has been allocated for projects that have seen literally zero work done thus far. This morning, we turn our attention to $200 billion worth of COVID relief fraud. As the Trump administration prepares to take office in less than a month, addressing government waste and fraud is a top priority for the newly formed Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE. We've talked about that. The advisory group, which is set to be led by Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, is focusing on quick wins, particularly targeting fraud in COVID relief funds, as billions of dollars has been distributed to potential fraudulent entities. In a recent letter to Musk and Ramaswamy, Senator Jody Ernst, the Republican from Iowa, reports that at least 17% of COVID-19 economic injury disaster loans and paycheck protection programs, PPPs as they were known at the time, or more than $200 billion were distributed fraudulently. She cited a 2023 report from the U.S. Small Business Administration. The Office of the Inspector General, the SBA, and other federal agencies have seized and returned about $30 billion in COVID-19 funds to the Small Business Administration that were fraudulently doled out. The report reads in part, "In the rush to swiftly distribute COVID-19 EIDL and PPP funds, the SBA calibrated its internal controls. The agency weakened or removed the controls necessary to prevent fraudsters from easily gaining access to these programs and provide assurance that only eligible entities received funding. Back in 2022, NBC News reported that fundraisers spent about $80 billion, or about 10% of the more than $800 billion that was distributed under the Paycheck Protection Program, on luxury automotives, private jets, mansions, and elite vacations. In 2021, federal prosecutors alleged that out of nearly $900 billion worth of COVID unemployment relief programs, between $87 billion and $400 billion of that was allegedly stolen by international fraudsters. Yes, you heard me right. Could be upwards of $400 billion. Also, the Small Business Administration's Inspector General identified nearly $80 billion in EIDL and about $3.6 billion in Paycheck Protection Program funds as potentially fraudulent. According to the Department of Justice Inspector General, at least 98 investigations launched by law enforcement were publicly announced into various cases of fraud. Joshua Bellamy, a former wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, was sentenced to 37 months in federal prison. That was back in December of 2021 for fraudulently obtaining more than $1.2 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans from the federal government. The DOJ also charged Maurice Fain, an Atlanta reality TV star, with bank fraud after he got nearly $4 million in PPP loans from the federal government and allegedly used it to use some of those proceeds to purchase $85,000 in jewelry. Expenditures included a Rolex presidential watch, a diamond bracelet, a 5.73 carat diamond ring, and the lease of a 2019 Rolls-Royce, as well as loan payments and $40,000 of child support. That was according to news reports at the time. Another example involved a Texas couple who were indicted by the Department of Justice and accused of filing hundreds of fraudulent EIDL applications. In September, Congresswoman Virginia Foxx, who serves the 8th Congressional District here in North Carolina and is the chair of the Education and Workforce Committee, subpoenaed Kamala Harris's running mate, Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, in an alleged COVID-19 fraud scheme. Many prosecutors are referencing this to the largest fraud in U.S. history. In Jody Ernst's letter that was sent to the DOJ Advisory Group, she urged that Congress extend the investigation unit on pandemic relief. Its work is slated to end in March of 2025, so coming up here pretty soon. Ernst wrote in her letter, "Some swindlers who uploaded pictures of Barbie dolls as photo identifications on applications were even approved to receive money. But the Biden administration is being lax in terms of recollecting the cash, and time is running out. The Special Inspector General for Pandemic Recovery investigating the grifts expire in March unless Congress extends its mission until every penny is returned." So that is one of our continuing series, our Waste Watch series over at CarolinaJournal.com. And there's no question about it. A lot of fraud took place. We went over some of those examples in regards to COVID-19 relief. And you can imagine the Department of Government Efficiency, which is going to be very, very busy as we head into the new year, that is obviously going to be one of the main things that they will be tackling. We'll see if Congress goes ahead and extends this investigatory body and allow some of these things to continue as we head deeper into 2025. Well, that's going to do it for a New Year's Eve edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. Thank you so much for being with us here this morning. Happy New Year. We are back live Thursday morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.